So overall, we are pretty good at this thing called person impression. However, we still at times overlook talent like Susan Boyle's, fall in love with the wrong person, and trust people we shouldn't. There's definitely room for improvement here. So what increases our accuracy? A number of things, and let's start with mood. Being happy signals that all is well. The world is safe and rewarding. We don't feel a need to be vigilant and careful. We feel confident in simplified judgments when we're happy, so we are more vulnerable to biases then. In contrast, negative mood signals that all is not well. Sadness especially signals loss. People tend to rely less on simplified judgments and think more carefully when they are sad or depressed. So impressions are most accurate when we are experiencing negative mood. High need for cognition makes people less vulnerable to some, but not all biases. Need for cognition is the degree to which people enjoy thinking. People high in need for cognition prefer jobs and hobbies that challenge their thinking. People who are low in need for cognition do not. If we are unaware of our biases, being a high need for cognition scorer cannot help us to avoid them. Remember spontaneous trait transference from earlier in this lecture? STT, as it is commonly called, is an example of a bias that operates largely outside of awareness. Thus, it is not affected by need for cognition. But we are often aware of biases, especially after taking this class, right? People who are high in need for cognition tend to be less vulnerable to biases of which they are aware. And this brings us to questionnaire number 4. The need for cognition scale. How do you compare to the U.S. student mean? The U.S. student mean is 81.8. Most often, we are not intentionally forming impressions of people. Instead, it's a byproduct of our other day-to-day social encounters. You formed an impression of the clerk who checked out your groceries, the student who spoke with you briefly in class, the bank teller who cashed your check, etc. However, there are times when we form impressions intentionally, like when interviewing a job candidate, or going on a first date, or interviewing a potential subleaser for our apartment. When we intentionally form impressions, we are more likely to seek information beyond expectancies, consider alternatives, and seek other causes of behavior. Want to supersize the accuracy benefit of intentional impression formation? Add these two: personal relevance and avoiding distraction. If you're going to be working closely with the person you hire rather than in another department, if you are dating seriously with the goal of finding a life partner as opposed to just having fun, and if you are seeking a roommate rather than a subleaser, accuracy tends to be increased even more because each of these scenarios has become more personally relevant. Finally, avoid distraction. When we are distracted, we tend to fall back into simplistic thinking. The numbers study, we will call this the numbers study, found that just having to hold 7 numbers in memory caused participants to be more likely to stereotype others. Still, there's no guarantee, right? Susan Boyle had a dream, and her dream would not have come true if she had not been given a chance to sing. Even though the judges were intentionally forming impressions of her, and personal relevance was high in that the judges are personally responsible for finding the best talent, it was clear that they first thought she was just wasting their time. The judges were distracted by their powerful first impressions that brought up many stereotypes: ageism, classism, weightism, and lookism. So overall, we are pretty good at person impression, but we still fall victim at times to many biases. Luckily for Susan Boyle, American Idol auditions and the British equivalent are structured in a way to allow all auditioners a chance to sing. So this concludes our lecture on interpersonal cognition. We've explored intrapersonal cognition, how we think about ourselves, in our first lecture, and interpersonal cognition, how we think about others, in this lecture. With our next lecture, we will conclude part 1 of our class, the social cognition part, by exploring attitudes. How do you think a college professor managed his attitude about himself after discovering he had the brain of a serial killer? We'll find out in our next lecture, Exploring Attitudes.